Hej och välkomna allihopa. Jätteroligt att se så många här. Trots relativt kort varsel med inbjudan som ni säkert alla märkte. Det blir bättre nästa gång. Jag heter Janne Elvelid. Jag är ansvarig för ett område som heter statistik och fakta här på .se som syftar till att ta fram statistik eller beskriva på olika sätt och vis hur internet utvecklas, framförallt i Sverige, men vi tittar även på övriga världen. Jag har stora förmånen att få jobba med lite olika människor. Bland annat så jobbar jag tillsammans med Olle Findahl som nyligen har skrivit rapporten Äldre Svenskar och internet som vi kommer få höra lite grann av honom om senare här idag. Och jag jobbar också tillsammans med en kvinna som heter Helsper från London School of Economics som har gjort många studier på området digital delaktighet och vilket är skälet till att hon är här idag. Och vi har satt ihop dagens seminarium som vi kallar för, på svenska kallar vi det Frånkopplad, att förstå och hantera digitalt utanförskap. Men för hennes svenska är inte riktigt på topp trots att hon pratar en oändlig massa olika språk så kommer vi hålla dagens seminarium på engelska, hela seminariet inklusive frågestund efter. Vi tänkte att Ellen kommer att börja sin presentation och vi väntar med frågor. Vi tar ett kort brensträckare efter hennes paus för att sen få lyssna en del till Olle och ta en diskussion och frågor tillsammans där. Så då tar jag och byter till engelska. I'm gonna start speaking English now to introduce our first speaker, Ellen Helsper, London School of Economics. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Right. Okay, let's make sure everything works. Okay, thank you for being here. Lots of people. Short notice, as Janne told me, and I think my Swedish is not very strong, but I think he was just saying this to you as well. How nice it is that you're all here. I'm going to talk today about something that I've been looking at for quite a few years, for about 10 years. And I always promised myself that when I do a presentation like this, that I should keep it simple. And then I realize after a few minutes that there is no way that you can talk about this in a simple way. It's not an easy topic. It doesn't have easy solutions. But I'll try to start, first of all, with a little bit of an overview of how people have been thinking about this topic of digital inclusion in general, in research, but also in a few of the projects that I've been involved in. And these have been research projects, but they've also been projects that were based around interventions or government policies to see how they've been evaluated and how effective they were. Now, there have been quite a few changes over the years, both in the way that people have thought about this topic and the way they've been researching it. So I'll try to go through it. If at any point you don't understand something I'm saying or need a little bit of clarification, or if at a certain point I talk too fast, then maybe let me know in a certain way, and then I can pause or try to explain it a bit better. Okay. So I'll start a little bit, and I said I tried to keep it simple, and the first slide already contains a lot of information. So I'll try to talk you through this. But I think the most important thing about this, the idea and the interest in studying digital inclusion is really because a lot of people are worried about how it connects to social inclusion. So it started from a concern with there's a lot of inequalities in society. Then some people came along with like, if we have this wonderful technology, something like the internet, where there's information and education, and you can communicate with people around the world, that somehow using that technology would also diminish a little bit the other inequalities, these social inequalities that we already knew about. So I think when we discuss digital inclusion, we need to be aware that it's not necessarily the digital inclusion that we are worried about and that we are striving for. It's not about getting as many people online as possible in some ways. It's about getting as many people as possible to use these technologies in a way that helps them in their everyday life. I think for policymakers, but also for academics in this field, that is the ultimate goal, to see if we can get people to use technologies in ways that improve their lives. And that is important because this has not always been reflected in the way that people have thought about it. Now, if you look at this figure that I have here, this is the result of a lot of years of research and about developments in the field. And I'll explain to you a little bit what it means. So on the left-hand side, where it says socioeconomic spheres, these are the areas of social exclusion or social inequality or vulnerability or disadvantage that people have been worried about, and that people have thought maybe technologies can help people to overcome some of these difficulties that they've been having. They tend to be divided in things like economic status. This is the most famous one. People have low income, low education. Maybe they get access to technologies and they can educate themselves or something like that. They can improve their lives economically. There's things like sociocultural background, often to do with discrimination, for example, or with just general disadvantage in not being able to achieve certain positions in society or have access to certain resources. There's the social environment, which is more like how we interact with other organizations in society. Like, are there our friends' networks, but also things like what's called as social capital, like are we part of organizations, are we part of things that organize in society? And then the fourth area that mainly psychologists obviously have been worried about is this idea of personal vulnerability or disadvantage and how technologies might help. So you have something, and in particular in terms of health, let's say people who lack self-esteem, or people who have certain, let's say, social isolation, who feel very lonely. Maybe if they can use technologies which allow them to communicate with other people, they will overcome that. So that is a sketch of, almost 100 years of research on social inclusion. There is a lot of research done in that area. Now then, when we move on to the right-hand side, and I'll go in a little bit more detail about that, we can see that you go through access to the technologies and skills in interacting with the technologies, and our motivations or our attitudes towards interacting with technologies, we go to what we actually do with technologies. And this is more recent. Yeah, most of the policies, and I'll talk about this, are aimed at breaking this idea that actually, even though we have a lot of hopes for technologies, that the socially isolated will become less isolated, that the lower educated will educate themselves, that actually what we've seen is that most engagement with technology and most access to technology replicates the patterns that are already there. Not only do people who have lower income and lower education tend to be less likely to have access, or high quality access, not only do they tend to have lower skills in relation to technology, but also when they have skills and when they have access, when they engage with the technologies like the internet, they tend to do those things that others would consider most beneficial for them. They don't tend to do them. So let's say, and it's logical in a way, if you don't have a lot of money, or you've had a lot of problems with education, then when you go online, you're not going to do things that have to do with money or with education. You tend to do those things that you feel most comfortable with. So we see a little bit of a repeating pattern. And this cycle is what people are trying to break through. How can we make sure that that doesn't happen? And what is the policy influence in this? So that's the rich get richer hypothesis, that those people who already have a lot, when they go online, they get more, in comparison to the people who don't have that much. So most of the beginning of the research and all the interventions in relation to digital inclusion have focused on getting people access, which is logical, because without access, you can't use the technology. So it's not a bad thing that there's a lot of initiatives out there to get everybody online and to get everybody not only online in a specific location, but to make sure that they can access it whenever they need it. So something about mobility and ubiquity of connections, but also about privacy, so that you get the chance to use it in a way on your own and learn on your own. So for example, having home access tends to be better than just having access in a public location like a library, because you can play with it and you can make mistakes and you can do it at your own rhythm. So there's a lot of policies out there. I've heard you have similar policies here, but in the UK we have something like super fast broadband. So it's about getting most people not only connected, but getting them connected with the highest speeds and things like that. So that's still going on. That's actually still a big part of most interventions. Now, it's logical that just access is not enough. You know, if you plug me in, but then I don't know what to do with it, or I don't know how to use it to my benefit, then what use is that technology for me? So after a really big focus on access, people have started to think more about what are the skills that we need to actually work with these technologies. And there has been a big development as well. First, people talked mostly about technical skills. Can you attach something to an email? Do you know how to install a virus scan? Do you know what a mouse is and where the on button is? Well, that's important. Again, you can't do without that. But the internet is starting to represent more and more our everyday lives. And there's more and more skills that you need that in some way can be found in, let's say, the real world or the offline world, but that have also some specific connection to what is happening on the internet. So other skills that people have been looking at are things like social skills. How do we know who to interact with where? How do you know what kind of information to give to which types of people? Who is reliable? That kind of thing. How do I find somebody if I want to ask them a certain question? And how do I know that the information that they give me is correct? And that links to this critical factor. This is an information factor. You know, you've all had this. You might have been looking for something, let's say a health type issue, and you type it in to a search engine, and you get 50 sites. Okay, how do you decide which one to trust or which combination of them to trust? So that's a very important skill that people have also been looking at. And then more recently, with Web 2.0, people have started saying, well, actually, to really be participating and take advantage of the technology, you also need to know how to create content. So it's becoming more and more complex, and we can see that people also at the European level are really thinking about how can we, encourage this. This is a little bit at the beginning. We don't really know well neither how to measure that or what it actually is. Motivations. This is really, and I won't spend much time with it, this is whether you think the technologies are going to do something good for you. Because I might be really good at using the technologies and I might have the most fantastic access, but if you think like actually in the end it's a lot better if I just go and talk to my neighbor instead of sending them an email, which actually might be a good idea, then obviously you're still not going to use the internet for these things. Now, and this is where we come to something that is a little bit more contentious. There's more discussion about this. There's more conflict about this, because this is where we come in a more normative area of when we talk about digital inclusion. This is what are we supposed to do with the technology? And an analogy that I often use is with schools. Would we consider it enough if young people had access to schools, if they, were more or less intelligent, and even if they were motivated to learn, but then they would go to school and the only thing they do would be the gym class? Yeah? Would we consider that a good education system? Or they go and the only thing they do is talk to their friends in the courtyard and they become really good communicators, but they don't get math or they don't get English. So in the education system, we've made certain decisions about what the basic things are that everybody needs to do to be part of this society. But that is a normative decision. This is a decision about what do we consider to be inclusion. Yeah? And in the digital world, that is no different. Okay. So here's our links of some of the things that have been come up as things that we need to do to be happy, well-formed people who can participate in society. And you can see, I'll show you now quickly before I go on to some statistics, I think. But so these are the factors that I will show you now that have been shown to have the strongest relationship with how people engage with technologies. So in the economic field that I showed you earlier in the model, education, income, and occupation, and especially whether you're employed or not, or whether you're a student or not, those are three very important factors in determining access and skills, attitudes, but also what we do with the technology. And especially education is really strong in determining the breadth of things that people do with technology. Cultural factors, generation. Yeah, we all know this. Jana mentioned the report that was published before. Older people, still, age is a very important factor. And some of the stuff that I will show, and I think Ole will talk about that afterwards as well, is that, but it is not all. We can see that when you just look at the older group, things like education, things like gender, things like occupation make a very big difference among older generations. And some of the research in Europe shows that even amongst young people who all have access, these cultural factors make a big difference in terms of skills and how these young people engage with technologies. Some of these things are differences, yeah? It's not necessarily that one is better or worse, but some are just differences. So we have social, which is about how active are you in society and how isolated you are. Health, disability, still one of the most important factors in determining access to as well as skills. And then we have personality. These, as I said before, are all linked and feed back into specific types of engagement with the technology. And what we mostly find is a reinforcement, but there are some signs that there are also a breaking of that cycle. And I'll try to talk about that a little bit more. Now, for a long time, there was this idea that if we waited long enough and everybody would get access to the internet or to technologies, then we wouldn't have to worry about digital inclusion or inequalities anymore. Now, there's a lot of calculations behind this, but these are two indexes. One at the bottom that you can see on this graph is about social inclusion. And this is a measure that is used by the National Office of Statistics that we have. So the further you go to the right, the more socially included you are. So there's a number of indicators that they include on this. You know, if you have 5 out of the 6 on the high level, you are included. We created a similar measure for digital inclusion, which includes access, skills, attitudes, and what you do with the technology. So the people at the top of this graph will have high quality access, will have a lot of skills, a lot of different skills, will have generally positive attitudes and feel that they can control the technology, and will do a lot of different things with the technology. Those at the bottom have none of that, yeah? And then there's a lot of variation in between. So what we can see is that actually, this is for the UK, for the World Internet Project data that has been collected in the UK, we can see that this relationship has not become weaker. For a bit in 2005, we thought, oh, this is going the right way. It's going, you know, less steep, which is the more steep, the stronger the relationship. But then in 2007 and 2009, it went up again. And you can't see actually the 2007 graph because it's under the 2009 graph, and it's almost exactly the same. So these relationships, even when more people get online, these social inclusion factors are still important in terms of skills and what people do with the technology. I'll break this apart for you because obviously in social inclusion, there's a lot of different things that are included there, a lot of different groups. Also in terms of, you know, digital inclusion, there's a lot of different things that we measured. So I'll focus on that most basic one first, the access one. And I already said before that a lot of research shows that having home access and high quality home access tends to lead to better engagement because you have more freedom to play with the technology. So this is over the years, again in the UK, but from the international research that I've done, we see a lot of patterns that are very, very similar across Europe and across other countries. So the data on 2003 were a little bit less reliable, so I've made them lighter than the rest. But so we can see, and this is age, we can see that the difference, and this is the difference between the oldest group, which in this graph is over 65 years old, and the youngest group, which is in this case under 25 years old, has stayed almost exactly the same. Even though both groups have used the internet more, or have more home access, it's almost constant at around 44%, the difference between the lowest and the highest education. Okay? This is socioeconomic status. It's increased, this difference between the highest group and the lowest group, which means that probably in the higher group, more people got connected, and in the lower group, people stayed more or less at the same level. We can see similar things for education. Yeah? We can see the same for income. differences have gotten bigger between the highest and lowest group. Disability, people without a disability and not, that has not changed much, same over the years. Gender, okay? Very small gender difference in access, we know that, I know that in Sweden also. Very little difference, but you know, that 3% remains there. I doubt it's significant. Okay. So what do we see here? I'm now showing those which were the strongest predictors of home access, and I'm splitting the groups out just to give you a better idea. So this is the highest socioeconomic status group and the lowest socioeconomic status group. You can see that actually for some reason in the UK this has gone down a little bit, but that's not a significant difference between the years. But you can see that the patterns are the same. So when the higher socioeconomic group goes up, the lower socioeconomic group goes up, but with exactly the same. So the differences are not getting smaller between this group. When you would look at the gender graph, the differences were getting a little bit smaller. But here when we talk about education, the lowest one, let's say the dark line, is those people who have not finished secondary or high school. The highest one is people who have had a university degree. We can see that in the UK, people with lower education levels are actually getting slightly less likely that they have home access. Those with high education, 91%. And this is for the whole population. Income, same, parallel lines. Difference is not getting smaller, yeah? Now, the UK is a country with really big income differences, yeah? So this is reflected in the online world, I think. Let's see if we can get to the next slide. Yeah, okay, so that was access, yeah? Now we talk about access is not necessarily the same as use, but when we start talking about use, so do you actually use the connection that you have, or connections that you have, doesn't have to be at home, to use the internet, we see bigger differences, yeah? Education, and this doesn't include students, yeah? 84% difference between those who have not finished education and those who have a university degree. In use, yeah, not access. Age remains more or less the same. Income and socioeconomic status, we see an increase, okay? So this kind of says that we will continue to have to worry about this, even if more people get access to the technologies. We still have to worry about it. Okay, a few more things about how people have been talking about digital inclusions, the reasons why people might not be engaging with the technology, or why are they disconnected, yeah? So mostly it started at the bottom. This was when everybody was mostly worried about access. And people say, okay, exclusion. Yeah, this means that you just can't afford it. There's no way, it's outside of your control. You're excluded. Yeah? Mostly to do with material wealth. I can't get access because I don't have the money, or I don't live somewhere where there's a connection. Yeah? Now with the changing internet and the changing possibilities that it offers, we also see a change in the way that people have talked about the reasons for why people exclude themselves. So the next step is acculturation or socialization. There's still quite a few groups for whom, you know, it might not be completely part of how they see themselves as being part of this group. We see that sometimes in ethnic minority groups, and I have an example later on of some young people who say, well, this is not really something that we do. Yeah, that's for white boys or something. Used to be that girls said more or less the same thing. Before communication technology exploded and we had social networking, they were saying, well, you know, computers, boys and their toys, but it's not really for us. That was often something about that. So that is also kind of more exclusion, not necessarily by choice, because it's not, you know, based on your personal data. And then you get a step higher. And you can see that this is representing those areas that we were talking about in social exclusion and how that has been measured. Social pressure, yeah? If nobody around you is using the technology, yeah, then maybe you're not going to either. It doesn't have to be overt pressure and people say you shouldn't do it, but it doesn't make that much sense. And then obviously when we get to the top, it's personality. And this is when we say people choose not to use the technologies. They know what it can do, but they just say, this is not for me, it's a conscious choice. In that middle area, there's that gray area of forced choice, yeah? Okay, these people might say that they're not interested or that they, this is, that's not really for them, but it's really based on how certain roles in society have been defined or the environment that they live in. So this is where we have come, and this is a concept that we're working with now. A concept that has actually been used quite a lot when we talk about socioeconomic exclusion is this idea of relative exclusion. In socioeconomic terms, people have talked about it in the way that, if you're poor in a poor country or in a poor neighborhood, being poor is not that bad. If you are poor when everybody else around you has a yacht and a broadband connection, and 5 dogs and 6 cars, then being poor really is a problem, Now, you can see, especially when we talk about things like forced choice, that this relativity becomes very important. So, for some key clusters, being digitally excluded is a big problem. Let's say parents of children. If you have a child in school and you do not have access, or you do not know how to use technology, or you only know how to use it in a very limited way, that is a relatively far bigger disadvantage for you than it is for somebody who is 70 years old and lives in a care home with a lot of other people around them who also don't use the technology. So this is something important to keep in mind when we talk about how we define exclusion and what it means. That it's also about our everyday life, our world, and how do we see it, how do we see the use. This is related to another issue, which we've called proxy use. Now, in the UK, there's still 30% of people who do not use the internet. I know it's a lot smaller here, that percentage, but it's still 30% of people. Now, if you look at that 30% of people, actually about 2/3 of those, it's not that they're completely excluded. Like, it's not that they do not use the internet. They often have somebody that if they really need to get something online, they do it for them, So they have some kind of interaction with technology. Now, when I talk to people in the UK, for example, in healthcare, or people who work with technologies to provide services, this is something that is very important for them. Why? Because they need to design their digital services not actually for the client, the person that they are trying to help, but for those proxy users, for those people in between. So they need to understand who are these people, what are their skills, what is their knowledge, So again, this is another step onto this ladder of exclusion, and what does that mean, and how can we use this, And we can see that often those people who are most excluded, socially isolated people with low education and low income, those are the people who do not have proxy users, or when they have them, they tend to be inexperienced kids, who they have to rely on. So this again is important to keep in mind. Oh, empty slide. Right. Okay, so now for a few more minutes, I'll talk about the reasons that people give. Because we've seen there's a relationship between those two, and we can draw some conclusions about maybe it's about money, maybe it's about a cultural issue, maybe it's something social that's going on, or maybe it's just a person's choice, personality. But, you can ask people why they do not use the technology, You don't have to go in a random way about this. This is not an easy question to ask, okay? Because there's social desirability. People might want to give a certain answer because there is, because that feels like that's more acceptable. So we've asked this question in different ways. I think actually there was supposed to be another one here, but don't know what happened to that slide. Here. So this particular one shows that, we can see, this is not very readable, I'm sorry, but the one that starts at 49% and goes up to 85% is when people say that they are not using the internet because they are not interested, In 2005, about half of the people who didn't use the internet said that that was a reason, or actually, it was an important reason for them for not using the internet. In 2009, 85% of people who don't use the internet say this was a reason for them, You can see that not having skills, which is that top line, has remained a reason for about 74%. It's not gone down. Let me just make sure that I get this one right. I think 68% is cost, or maybe it's access. Sorry, it's access. So that is also, well, it dipped a little bit in 2007 and went up again in 2009. This is relatively the same, and the same for not having, or for it being too costly. Now, it's important when you look at these types of graphs and this is just for people who have never used the internet. If you look at people who may have used the internet a bit before, the graphs looks relatively the same, but a lack of interest is slightly less important, and not having access is slightly more important. But it looks very much the same in terms of the pattern. It's very important to realize that the non-users in 2005 is a different group in terms of who they are and what their characteristics are from the group in 2009. They differ in some socioeconomic ways. They tend to be slightly older and things like that. But also important is that in 2005, a lot of people had one important reason why they didn't use the technology. In 2009, the people who don't use the internet have a lot of different reasons why they don't use the technology. So the way we interpret that in our research is that actually those people in 2009 who are non-users are going to be a lot more difficult to get online, because they say, well, yes, I'm not interested, but it's also too expensive and I don't have the skills and it costs too much, yeah? Well, in 2005, people tended to say, okay, it's just because I have no access. Easy solution, you give them access, they go online. Okay, now they have a range of reasons. And if you look at this, breaking it down, then again, it's those people with low education, who are socially isolated, who have low income, all these kind of vulnerabilities. Those are the people who have more different reasons for why they are not using the technologies. So there's a kind of a replication of patterns. This is a little bit of a, I guess, tough luck message, because it's becoming more difficult to do something about digital inclusion. This group is getting slightly smaller, but in the UK it's not getting that much smaller, the people who don't use the technology. Most people have access, but it's not going as quickly as we want. I talked in the beginning in this model that it's important not just to look at access, not just to look at skills, but also what are the particular things that we do with technology. Now, this is a graph with a lot of dots and a lot of things on it, so let me just explain quickly what you might see here. When you see the kind of red marked graphs, gray circles, are types of activities that go together. So, and you can see clusters of groups of people, yeah, types of people. So in the top left corner, we will see that there's a cluster that is kind of single young students, yeah? They are very close to that top right bubble of activities, which means that they are the most likely to be doing those types of activities. This is about people who actually use the internet, yeah? However, when it comes to other types of activities, they're actually quite far removed from these. So we can see, for example, things like buying stuff, which is logical because they don't have that much money, but engaging in politics or civic education, yeah, or things that have to do with money, they are quite far away removed from that. So these young people might be online and even spending a lot of time online, but they might not be doing those things that normatively we think as adults or as other people interested in this area that they should be doing. Those among the users, those who have secondary education only, who have low income, who are unemployed, who are low socioeconomic status, are the furthest removed from all those activities. And they're especially far removed from those activities that might make them richer, might get them educated, and things like that. They're slightly closer to entertainment. So this is one way of looking at the data. So there is quite a bit of evidence. And I did something similar in Sweden, where the distances were slightly less big. It was published in a chapter. If you're interested, I can tell you where it was. Difference was slightly less big, and there were some individual things that were different, but you could see the same pattern appearing.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Just a short question. How do you interpret the axis?
This is a principal component analysis. So it is more like a cluster, a clustering of data. Then these axes, I know I shouldn't have put numbers on there. They don't necessarily, it's distances between points. So it's not like higher up the x-axis means something and more towards the right means something. But it's about the distances between points. So you could turn these horizontally and it would mean different things.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. How much time have we got? Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is a very colorful graph, but it basically shows which activities are people the least likely to take up in the beginning and which are they most likely to do when they are more advanced. So what we can see, shopping and travel and entertainment, and these are young adults, are the things that even if you do only 1 or 2 things or 3 things, these are the things that you do. Yeah? So if you do about 8 things, which is what most people, young adults do, about 8 different types of activities online, yeah, then you are likely to do all those, plus doing kind of fact-checking and education, some networking, a little bit of finance. But only those people who do the broadest range of activities, which is civic, which is like about 11 or 12 of these general categories, tend to do things that governments are most worried about, which is e-government, civic participation, and things like diary, which is blogging and participating in that way. Okay, so only the people who are furthest on that ladder. Okay, so I probably won't have enough time to go through all the projects that I worked on in detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to flag up what these were. And then if you're interested in one of these particular projects, then come and talk to me or ask some questions afterwards and I can tell you a little bit more about them. But the things that I've worked on, I showed you some of the World Internet Project data for the UK. I'm working on a big study, and Ole is working on this one as well, which is the EU Kids Online project, a big survey in Europe, for those of you who don't know, of 9 to 16-year-olds. 26,000 children across Europe were surveyed, plus their parents. Yeah, this report is online, and Sweden is in there, so you can definitely have a look. An IPTS survey, which is the Institute for Prospective Technology Studies, which tried to find out a methodology to both for interventions and for research to reach those groups who we know never participate in studies, who are not in any of the graphs that we have, and I'll talk about who they are. Another project that I work on was with the Travelers Times, which you see here, which is an organization that looks at travelers and gypsies. It's quite a big group in the UK, and there's quite a big concern because they are kind of the most excluded group in society. They are mobile, they have low education, low literacy, they're very much discriminated against. They have a lot of problems. And then there's my PhD project, which I did quite a few years ago at the same institution where I'm working now, even though I've been away, which was about disabled youth and some other discriminated groups online. So these kind of reflect 5 key groups in the UK that people who work in digital inclusion policies are concerned about. The first is those who are socially isolated, because they tend to be so much disadvantaged in terms of the proxy users, in terms of any kind of connection with technology. NEETs, which is young people, so 14 to 25s mostly, who are not in education, employment, or are following any kind of other training. Yeah? Ethnic minorities, these mobile communities, and disabled individuals. What all these 5 groups have in common is that we know very little about them. Even when we do a lot of research, the way it's traditionally been done, we know very little about them. Why? Because these are the groups that do not participate in research. Yeah? Ethnic minorities, and I can show you that actually. I'll show you some of that might be a nice case study. This is what I mentioned before. So it says, I don't think minorities in general go for that, meeting people online. I don't think they're that open-minded generally. This is an African Caribbean teenager in the UK, and these are the kind of things that we see. So when you talk to individuals from different groups that represent these groups, you get a lot of this. Kind of something, this is not really part of our culture. You know, we have other things to worry about. Why would we go online, waste our time behind a computer when we could be hanging out with our friends? When you look at survey data, you can see that these, and this is from the EU Kids Online project, there's a little bit of a problem with the ethnicity question, but there's one that talks about discrimination, which I show here, is that actually when you look at the data that comes from surveys, these groups often seem very much engaged and very much included. And this is true for young people, but also for older people who participate in surveys. Why? Because those groups, when they do participate, they tend to be the higher educated, the more socially integrated people who participate in these surveys. Okay? So let me go to, I won't, if you're interested in that, can tell you a little bit more, because there's more research problems with that group. How do you get to people who don't have an address? You know, how do you ask them questions? How do you get to a community that actually is very wary of outsiders for very good reasons? Yeah. So let me show you this for disabled kids, which is interesting because there's a positive message. I also do like to give some positive messages, is that when you look at disabled teenagers or disabled people in general, they are less likely to have home access, often also because they have economic problems in families which have young people with disabilities. These young people tend to think they're less good at doing things. They tend to have more negative attitudes to what technologies can mean for them. They tend to have a lower range of activities when they are online that they do. But when you look at that, so even though they do a lower range of activities, they do tend to be engaged. So when they've overcome all these barriers, when they have been given access and they have access and they've been trained in skills and they do that, they do tend to do those things that help them in their situation. So they're more likely, that's the 21% versus the 8% who does not have a disability, to engage civically, which is a lot to do with fighting for your rights and coming up and doing these things. So I'm going to finish with this and then one more thing before we have a short break. When we look at all this, both the studies and the intervention and policy projects that I've been involved in, there's a few things that come up that are very clear. That you cannot do these digital inclusion projects without knowing about the social inclusion characteristics and the everyday lives, the circumstances, the relative exclusion, both socially and digitally, and all these kinds of things. So most of the projects that have been marked by, also in EU studies and in studies done in the UK, as best practice, are those that did not start with IT. Those projects that went into the community and said, we are going to do this wonderful thing, we're going to give you all these technologies, and this is all the fantastic things that you can do with them. Those tended to fail more than those that said, what are the problems that you are having? What are you doing right now? And how can we, maybe we can see if technology somehow can make that process easier. Those tend to be the ones that are successful. Seems logical, but a lot of projects are actually not set up like that. They start with the technology. So you need to take all those things into consideration. And I'll finish with this, which I called food for thought. It is extremely difficult, if you think back to that big model that I had in the beginning, where there was a link between social inclusion through access skills and attitudes towards digital inclusion, we actually know very, very little about how digital inclusion feeds back, engagement with technology actually feeds back and makes people's life better. Yeah? And this, as I said in the beginning, is what most people are really most worried about. And this is because measuring success or evaluating success of these types of things is very difficult, often because these projects have not been set up to think about all those different aspects. They do not have a clear definition of what inclusion is. And this is where you get to a normative solution or a normative debate, where policymakers and people who work in this kind of area need to figure out, what is it actually that we mean by inclusion? When will we consider someone included? How much is it somebody's choice? And remember that a lot of the people say, I'm not interested, I'm choosing not to use the technology, are exactly those people who have the most problems offline. So is that a choice? Is that a free choice or not? So can we leave it up to these different groups to tell us when they are included? Or is it the policymakers' jobs to say, actually, we're not going to be happy, or the educators' jobs, or whoever is involved in this, we're not going to be happy until you know how to do those things and you know to do them in an efficient way. If you know how to do them and you've done them, you've had experience, and then you still decide that it's all useless and worthless and you much rather go gardening and plant some nice flowers, that's fine, but that's about more the equality of opportunity than it is about equality of access. So I'll stop there because I think I've already gone over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. We're going to go back to some questions. I'm sure you all have some specific questions, but it's clear to me that sometimes I feel like
I set up those questions, what we're going to work on, and sometimes I feel like the good old days were better, where we just defined it. If they have access at home, they're included, and if they don't, they're excluded. So anyway, we know that's not the simple case. We're just gonna go for like a 7 minutes, 6 minutes breaks, I think, even 5 if. So just a short stand-up break, get some more coffee,
Do whatever you have to do, and we're gonna get back started. Just I can't see a clock anyhow, but 5-6 minutes.